Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode will be an interview about music and the cosmos in early Chinese thought with Erica Brindley, who is professor of Asian Studies, History, and Philosophy at Penn State. Hi, Erica. Thanks for coming
Hi,
on the
Peter.
podcast.
Hi,
Great
Peter.
to talk
Thanks
to
for
you.
having me.
Oh, yeah. It's a real pleasure to have you. As I just said, we're going to be talking about music and the cosmos. So it seems to make sense to start by talking about what we mean by each. Let's start with music. And you might think we wouldn't need to explain that, but I think actually we do, because music captures more than just sort of songs, right, in this context. So what cultural forms are we talking about here? And in fact, how do we even know about what we're calling music in, let's say, the Warring States period?
Sure. So music in ancient China is broadly conceived as not just kind of instrumental and lyrical performances and music or sound, but as something, as performances kind of writ large that include lots more of the visual dance components as well. So you could imagine that when they were referring to music, it's kind of a counterpart to ritual in ancient China, which was also a kind of performance, a kind of cultural, social engagement. And so the music was the parts that included the sonic, the visual, all the props and things like that. So it's a little bit different than what we think of as just, plain sonic music in our contexts. But intriguingly, when you really get into some of the descriptions of music and critiques of it in early China, they do seem to want to focus on the sonic parts. And so a lot of the other stuff seems to fall by the wayside conceptually. So I'm not convinced that it's so different, that this term is. It's just that it does tend to have a larger valence than when we use it.
And the reason we know about what it was is because we have texts like, let's say, in the Analects, it will refer to, rows of dancers and ringing bells and playing string instruments. Is that really how we know about what they were doing? Or is there like archaeological? I mean, presumably there's no ancient Chinese sheet music that we can consult that tells us exactly how it sounded, right?
You're absolutely right. We have lots of descriptions of how music might have been played in larger state ritual settings, but also in kind of more personal chamber orchestra types of settings, and also personal individual settings of people practicing and strumming on zithers and other more personal instruments of the elite class. So we have different levels of descriptions, and we know about also the official apparatus associated with music. There was a bureau of music, for instance, in most courts in early China. And especially when we get to the imperial times, the Qin and the Han, they all had music bureaus. And we can talk later as to why these are so important. So yeah, we do have these textual descriptions, and we also have remnants of instruments archaeologically. There's a very important find recently that Professor Lothar von Falkenhausen in UCLA has written on the bells of this Duke Zhangyi in about 4th century BCE China. And this is a phenomenal cache that has kind of changed our entire understanding of ritualized music in early China. And what's so intriguing about that particular discovery was that these are just gigantic bronze bell sets that were cast with 2 tones built into each bell. And so from that, we can see that they had this kind of very, very intricate modular system. They had very developed understanding of music theory. So we can just get clues like that about what music was like. Obviously, we can't ever hear what it actually sounded like because there's no recording. And as you mentioned, there's no notation to speak of. These were traditions that were passed on by professional musicians, and professional musicians and dancers tended to be not of the elite class, the ones who were doing the big state ritual music. The ones who are strumming on their zithers, like Confucius and his disciples, that's another issue. For the professional musicians, were not considered to be elites or maybe even literate.
Okay, so that's music. What about the cosmos? How do they conceive of the cosmos? How are ideas evolving around the cosmos in the Warring States period?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to preface this question, I think the relationship of music to the cosmos to us is not, very self evident. We're like, what? Music is something that we listen to, we enjoy. It's part of our cultural upbringing. There's pop culture and all of this. But why? I mean, I would never talk about it in relationship to the cosmos, right? And the reason I wrote about it in this book, Music Cosmology and Harmony in Early China, is that it just became apparent to me when I was researching these theories about music that there was something much deeper. And there were really, really large claims being made about the connection of music to the cosmos. And that it seemed to be a kind of religious orientation that involved music as one of its central tools. One of the important transformations in thinking that I try to outline in my work was that there were different and competing conceptions of cosmos, and that there was a particular version of a kind of resonant cosmos that was developing sometime around the 4th century BCE, when so-called naturalistic ways of thinking about the world around us were becoming much more prevalent. And so some people can refer to this kind of religious movement as, I mean, sometimes we just uh, erroneously or just in a simplified way refer to it as like Taoist or something like that. But it might actually be an orientation towards the cosmos, a kind of naturalistic cosmos that is coming from religious practices in a different region of China, for instance, perhaps the South. And so, what we might be seeing is a confluence of different kinds of traditions coming together around this period when trade and everything was opening things up. And so, we're just getting more stuff to understand competing and changing visions of the cosmos. So, in earlier times, I mean, a lot of people, scholars of religion, have talked about how there are very clear concepts of deities and intention and will, and the cosmos functions in this way, such that heaven, as the main deity, for example, in the Zhou period, is decreeing or commanding things. Heaven has a will, heaven has an intent, heaven has a kind of moral framework for us to follow. And that is very much, a legacy of the Zhou. We see it throughout Confucianism, etc. But this is changing in the 4th century BCE, and we see the emergence of this kind of more naturalistic view where you might refer to it as more deistic or kind of a mechanical cosmos, in a sense, but I would really avoid having us look at it as mechanical, because I do think this was very much a religious viewpoint, and that it was considered to be a good cosmos, and that balance and in this kind of resonant cosmos was the premier or primary characteristic of it. And that's something that we were supposed to achieve and try to achieve as human beings.
Can you
Does
say
that
a
make
little bit more about what it means for the cosmos to be resonant? So, is the idea that so we might have a musical instrument, like let's say we have some pitch pipes, and there's let's say 12 pipes, and then you say, okay, well the heavens can be divided into 12 segments. Like I'm sort of thinking about the zodiac or something. I'm kind of making this up, but is that the kind of thing we're talking about? So the sort of mathematical or other structures that we find in music would be transposed to the cosmos and vice versa?
I do think that some of these theories about how music is both a metaphor for the cosmos, but also that I mean, people go so far as to claim that music is actually the operation of the cosmos itself, almost literally. That's a really radical claim, but it exists all throughout this later period. So what we do see is not just a mapping out, a kind of analogy between the realms of heaven and its intrinsic idealistic resonances when everything's functioning right. So think about even in early Chinese religions where they're divining to find out, how humans should act in the world, whether they should go to war, whether they should appease this certain deity to help somebody get rid of their toothache or something like that. With divination, you're talking about humans fitting into an idealized world in which we have to figure out strategically where the world's heading, what the kind of cosmic shape of it is, and how we can strategically insert ourselves into that order. But things can go wrong with the cosmic order as well. And so you have omens, you have bad omens, you have drought, you have all sorts of disasters and natural disasters. And that's not what they're talking about with a resonant cosmos. That's what people and theorists are saying. This is all going haywire because of something that we're doing in the human world. So there's always this kind of back and forth between the heavenly and then the ideal forms of the heavenly and then the human realm. You talked about pitch pipe. Maybe we can talk about those later. It gets really complicated. I think of it as a later, more Han Empire kind of approach where they're actually stating that the actual pitch of these pipes serve as a standard for activating and connecting us to this cosmic order. And so, if our pitch pipes are in order and the sounds are properly tuned to the cosmos, the cosmic sounds, and this might be coming from music theory, that I don't think they were talking about actual planetary bodies emitting sounds, but they were definitely thinking of the relationships, the kind of mathematical relationships in music theory, like perfect fifths and all of those kinds of things that come out of harmony, a basic understanding of harmony, and trying to work that into their views of how we can connect into that. And then the pitch pipes were the fundamental way that we could set our standards in society. And the imperial court had a whole setup where, they had to make sure that those pitch pipes were pitch perfect, especially the yellow bell sound, which was the main fundamental sound that had to be absolutely standard. Like you set a clock. Otherwise, everything would go haywire, and crazy.
That's so interesting. Can I go back to something that you mentioned just a bit ago about the resonances or the harmony of the cosmos being somehow felt within or echoed within the human? Is that how the process of music composition works? So they sometimes, like the Confucians, sometimes talk about the fact that great sages actually wrote the music. Are they thinking that somehow like these sages are like antennas who are picking up the resonance of or the harmony of the cosmos and then they're putting that into audible musical form? Or is that too kind of
Oh,
blunt a way of thinking about
that's not out there at all. In fact, everybody's saying different things, first of all.
it?
So you can't just say they thought this about music because it's like, who? Okay, are you talking about Xunzi, who wrote extensively about music and had very specific visions of sagehood and human relationship to the divine, etc.? Or are you talking about maybe another Confucian who remains nameless? Maybe we're calling them of the Zizi school, where they're talking about sages who attune themselves through this kind of moral cultivation in such a way as to resonate morally with the cosmos. And so they're very different visions of that. But I do think, in terms of the sage creating music, there is an argument out there that sages, they're tuning into, so to speak, or they're tapping into fundamental kind of authentic truths about the cosmos and bringing those to the people so that they can kind of continue to resonate and benefit from the renewed connection between humans and the cosmos that this music will establish for us.
You just mentioned Xunzi, who's one of the great Confucian thinkers we've been following in the most recent episodes of the podcast. He's really interested in music, and he seems to think that music is very important in the political sphere and that it actually has a powerful function in terms of achieving what you in your book call cultural unification. Can you say something about how he thinks that works?
One thing that Xunzi says very powerfully about music is that it has the power to enter us deeply and transform us rapidly. Because of Xunzi's belief in the ultimate transformative powers of music, he thinks that it actually has an incredible use in kind of social engagement and also, I mean, I don't want to say propaganda, but also just basically swaying the population in certain ways. I mean, a lot of the early Confucians were very, very big Chinese, not chauvinists, but they really, really believed in the power of the Chinese culture. And by Chinese here, I'm talking about what they refer to as Huaxia. So it's not Chinese at all. It's the many Xia, many descendants of the Xia peoples, so to speak. And this could be a diversity of different peoples that live mostly in the Yellow River region areas. Xunzi is trying to make an argument, and it's a very powerful one, against the criticisms of the Moists that music doesn't mean anything and it's not important. We can kind of just get rid of it. It costs too much. It's a kind of luxury item. It's doing us no good. And it's very important for the Confucians to show that music is like ritual, and perhaps even more so than ritual, the most powerful means to transform us into moral beings. In his particular chapter on music, he focuses less on individual moral cultivation and really more on, well, maybe that's not true, but in the part that I write about, I really wanted to bring out the point that it's interesting that he uses music in this very broad way as a kind of tool for cultural unity. Because it transforms us, it also kind of brings the winds of our culture, and wind is and chi are very important concepts that not just carry sound, but they also kind of sound was thought of almost as a wind or a chi in itself. They had no concept of sound waves back then, but how is sound transmitted? If they think of it as almost the most unmediated form of mediation out there. So because of its powerful ability to interact with our emotional states and kind of work on the ways in which we interact with others, then it could bring about a kind of overarching sense of this is the way we should be as a culture. And this goes back to Confucius as well. I mean, he's very into the Huaxia cultural superiority. And it's just interesting that Xunzi, at this moment, right before this great imperialist turn occurs in China, is speaking that way because, after all, he was the teacher to one of the greatest and most evil architects of the Qin period, the Li Si. He was a high minister for the first emperor who did a lot of harm. And, he studied under Xunzi. So I think it's important to bring out these aspects too, that, people were using music for political ends.
It's actually very plausible, I think. I mean, if you think about something like military music and the way that it could help unify and direct the energy and focus of an army. And of course, they had military music missions. So one of the kinds of music he talks about is war dancing, right? Where you have the soldiers preparing to fight by experiencing music and dancing together. You could think of it as a warning just as much as a kind of resource for a good ruler to draw on. A bad ruler could draw on it as well, presumably.
Exactly. And I'm thinking of another statement he makes about how music transforms us, whether it is to go out and attack and be aggressive as aggressors. It can rile us up, it do all that, but it can also teach us about how to interact in a more yielding and pacifistic way with each other. So there was this kind of very interesting use of and discussion of how music is useful in that it can cover so many different kinds of emotions and be channeled in those ways.
That's the body politic then. Maybe we could think about the individual human body as well. You mentioned qi just a moment ago, and maybe that's the mechanism by which music affects the individual human body, because obviously music does have a very powerful effect on the body as well. And they were aware of that.
There are some writings that really try to go into the mechanism by which music affects our emotions through chi and through almost immediate responsiveness. I think that's another way that people describe the way music evokes our certain kinds of reactions and feelings and realizations. Even sometimes they're moral realizations about restraint, about about respect or guilt or even feeling what, like an earlier emperor, transcending time and going back to a period when this kind of music was supposedly played, and because of that powerful effect on our first chi and then emotions, we're able to feel what they felt. So there's this kind of empathic connection that we can have with time travel with people of the past, with great figures of the past, and learn from them, much as we learn from, supposedly, from learning about history. This was a big thing for Confucius, reading the histories, reading the odes, which are songs, hymns, or sometimes they're translated as poems. How is it that we learn from poems about morality? Well, this was a big deal, and was a big topic of conversation in Confucian ethics.
So this idea of resonance can actually go across time as well as across space, right? So you've got this idea that there's a resonance between musical instruments, and then there's a resonance between the individual human and the cosmos. There's a resonance between the cosmos and the political structure of the state. And then there's even resonance across generations or something like that.
Yeah, and between individuals, I mean, we haven't talked about the concept of gene. The Jinja is the person who knows your sound. And that's supposed to be the most intimate and deep kind of connection you can have with a friend in early China. And it's all expressed in terms of music and sound.
Can you say a little bit more about that? I find that very kind of intriguing idea. So the thought is that if, like, I've got a best friend and we're resonating on the same frequency or something like that. I mean, that's obviously a metaphor.
Well, not necessarily resonating on the same frequency, but maybe. I think what they really refer to with the dream knowing your sound is that well, I guess they do. They pick up on your frequency because they know it. They can detect it once, and they see it, and then they can start to empathize in the same way with you. So it is somebody who truly knows you. You know, when there's a performer performing music, the dream, or the person who really knows your sound, is the person who knows what you're feeling when you're playing certain stanzas or phrases like that. They can interpret almost every moment as you're going through it in terms of what you're feeling, what you're thinking of. If you're thinking about, a happy cricket that's jumping up, or if you're thinking about a sad tale of war or something like that, they can pick up on that, and that's a very common trope in the writings. Yeah.
Are they also thinking about the idea of musical performers playing together? I mean, am I supposed to think of like two friends as playing a duet, or is it more like one is the audience and one is the performer?
That's so interesting. I don't recall an instance in which they're playing as a duet. It's always somebody's out there, and either there's this metaphorical sense of they are your knower of sounds, or there's an actual connection with music that you're playing and they know your sound because they're hearing that and they're feeling it as you play. So yeah, that is interesting. I haven't thought of it before that way. Why it would be that maybe there just wasn't as much of the duet kind of perform. That can't be right. There's got to have been duets. I don't know why they didn't write about that. It's
Mhm.
interesting.
So obviously, taking together everything we've said, music has very deep and broad consequences. It's like ritual, as you said at the beginning. There's a passage in Lunyu in the Analects where Kongzi says that someone who could explain a certain ritual could have the whole world as if it was in the palm of his hand. And I suppose that the same thing goes for music, right? If you really understood music, then you'd obviously understand everything, right? You'd understand the cosmos, politics, the self, interrelationships. So it really covers everything, right?
So I'd say that for the Confucians, music was even more important than ritual. And they say this at several points in almost every single treatise that you're reading, that mentions music, that somehow it's superior. It's the most superior form of transforming you morally. All throughout the Analects, if you start to look at it, Confucius, he talks about it as being the pinnacle of understanding, the absolute pinnacle. And that in a sense, it's almost as though they thought of music as encompassing ritual as well as it's just something larger and more effective. And so ritual functions in many of the same ways, but music is the one that really does all that, but also brings you to almost perfection, like sagely perfection. This idea of being a nobleman is one of the goals of Confucianism, but an even higher goal is to be the sage. And so it's almost as though the ritual accomplishes that first goal for you, but the music is what takes you to the next level of being truly a wise sage.
Is there any kind of limitation to this? I mean, are there limits beyond which we can't expect to go as humans, or can we hope to understand the cosmos and our place in it fully and completely if we become kind of masters of music in this sense?
I wonder the extent to which the early Chinese thinkers, when they talk about music in this way, that they truly believe it. I think they truly believe that music was very powerful for the emotions. But I have a hard time thinking that they thought it was the end all and be all, period, because there used to be these six classics and music was included in it. Ritual and music were kind of a pair. And then the music part got lost as Confucianism was being formulated in the Han or being really developed in the Han period. You wonder, well, if music was so important to them, this classic of music would have been saved. It would have been the sixth classic instead of only the five classics. And so something happened. I mean, they're making all these claims and about music, and sure, a lot of it is rhetorical, but you see them also practicing that. So I think the limit is visible in the tradition itself because they're not necessarily focusing on music only. They really believe that the paths to morality, the paths to connection and fitting in with the cosmos are much more complicated and they involve a whole variety of things, not just music. There are definite limitations, but I do think that this overwhelming sense of a resonant cosmos kind of sticks with East Asia for a long, long time. And it infiltrates into all sorts of more technical areas, such as medicine, especially medicine, history of science, things like that, where you're seeing explanations being given for why things occur in terms of a kind of resonant theory of the cosmos. Music fits very nicely as an explanation for a resonant cosmos. And so it's intriguing that, these concepts of harmony, resonance, balance, fitting in, these were all very, very strong ideals from early on in the tradition. And they only got stronger as tradition kind of developed through what we call now a cosmology of, we call it five phases cosmology, which became very prevalent in the Han. And it was the system of correlations based on intrinsic resonances among distant objects. So that's really interesting that it is, in some ways, a very, very powerful conception, music is, and resonance and all of the related concepts. And it continues to be so.
Okay, well, in that case, the listeners will need to bear all this in mind as we go forward. These are things we're going to be touching on in the future. So we'll have episodes on medicine, we'll have an episode on the five phases theory, and so on. And this conception of the resonance cosmos will continue to be resonant as we touch on those other topics. For now, I will thank Erica Brindley very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Peter. It was so much fun to talk about this.
Yeah, I agree. And I hope the listener will also have had fun and will continue to have fun as we move on through a last few episodes where we're still going to be talking about aspects of Confucianism, including religion and Confucianism, which is something that came up in this conversation here on the History of Philosophy in China.